Welcome back. Here's where it gets really interesting, folks. We've been talking about diet, and we've been talking about protein, fat, and carbs, the macronutrients. That's protein, fat, carbs. We've been talking about the diet, talking about the macronutrients, and getting the ratio of protein, fat, and carbs down. Now that's real important because your fast oxidizers versus your slow, you need more carbs. If you're a slow oxidizer, you need more protein and fat. The more of a fast oxidizer you are. And you can dial that in like a radio dial. You know, if you're a protein type fast oxidizer, you know, you're going to be adjusting the amount of protein and fat until you dial it right in, dial it right back. And then that should be the perfect, let's say, breakfast. You might get it, man, just right to the right amount. And by the way, back to that video where we talked about breakfast. I said, you know, make some ham and some eggs and eat some vegetables from the night before, whatever you want to put in there. That's how you do it. And I said that should get you through to breakfast or through to lunch. Your breakfast should get you through to lunch, feeling satisfied, feeling energetic, and feeling like you're in a sense of well-being, you know, in a good mood and that sort of thing. If you don't eat enough, you're going to get hungry. You got to kind of fill the tank up. So what you might try the next morning, if you felt good solid energy and you felt well-being and you felt satiation for quite a while, maybe 3 hours, and then you got hungry, if it's good honest hunger, that's not a bad thing. It just means you need to just eat again. You know, what'll happen with hunger comes kind of a blood sugar goes down and different things can happen, but you just want to eat again, but eat another little meal of the same proportions that worked for you at the first meal. Now, you can also try snacking, but it's not as good as getting to the next meal. And so that's what I would do, along with being real well hydrated and keeping your elimination process going and things like that. So you want to drink lots of water as you learn to eat like this. So you're going to first balance out your macronutrients, the amount of protein, fat versus carbs. You're going to keep it balanced, and you're going to dial your own ratio in. And that'll work very well for you. So that's the macronutrients. Now what we haven't talked about is something else that's really important, and it's more or less the micronutrients. And that is vitamins, minerals, and we'll just call them phytonutrients. There's other stuff in food and food products that are important to be in there, and trace minerals and different things. But you got your micronutrients. So this is more like the ratio, and this is more like, well, which specific ones? Because when you talk about protein and fat, well, that means basically meat for most of us. Well, there's chicken, and there's turkey, and there's beef, and there's buffalo, and there's elk, and there's rabbit, and there's pork, obviously, and veal, and there's all these things, and then there's eggs and stuff like that. So there's all of these ways to get protein and fat. Your eggs, of course, you might want to cook them in some pure butter, some really good quality fats and that sort of thing. But that's where these micronutrients come in, because what they do is they work in a different way. They don't really affect the oxidative rate very much. What they do affect, though, is the autonomic nervous system. And I need to kind of, let me just try this. I'll try balancing it this way. And this is a lot of information, so you might want to watch this a couple times. I'll try to go slow so you get it. But we have the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic. Sympathetic. I hope you can see that. Sympathetic. And we have what's called the parasympathetic. Now these are all part of your autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is the part of your brain and your body, the nervous system that controls digestion and heart beating and all these processes in your body that you don't have to think about. So anything that's on automatic pilot, again, breathing, you don't have to think about breathing. You can go to sleep, your body still automatically breathes, it still automatically keeps your heart beating. It will automatically digest food and move it through the tubes until the urge comes to eliminate that and that sort of thing. So all this happens autonomically, and there are two branches of the autonomic nervous system. One's called the sympathetic and one is called the parasympathetic. The sympathetic is basically your fight, flight, and again, this is autonomic, meaning automatic. So fight flight kicks in when you get excited about something. If you're driving and someone cuts you off, your fight flight kicks in. That's your sympathetic nervous system. So those nerves, which basically you could say start in the brain, they go and they tell automatically. They tell certain organs to crank up certain hormones. Like for instance, sympathetic nervous system, you're in the fight flight, you get a lot of cortisol. Cortisol is your stress hormone, so cortisol would go up. Well, how does that happen? Well, the sympathetic nervous system tells a part of your adrenals to make more adrenaline, and adrenaline goes up, and then adrenaline affects another part of the brain and the adrenal glands and makes more cortisol. So this is like a chain reaction. You have no control over it. It's going to happen. And your blood pressure would go up and your eyes would dilate. You can actually see a little bit better when you're under stress, at least in low light and that sort of thing. So there's lots of protective mechanisms that go into action when fight flight is stimulated, and that's the sympathetic nervous system. Now, you obviously wouldn't want to be that way all the time. That's more or less something that's going to kick in excess or extra when you need it. And so that's enough on that for just now. The parasympathetic nerves control, we would basically call them rest and digest. Some people say feed and breed because they do control more your relaxation response. Like digestion happens when the parasympathetic is kicking in. It helps move food through the small intestine into the large intestine and then out, and that's sort of a rest and digest thing. Reproduction is basically a parasympathetic activity. And so it makes sense here that these things should be in balance. If you are stimulated sympathetic, if your sympathetic is stimulated, you're in the fight flight, you won't be digesting your food and you won't be thinking about reproduction, and your reproduction organs aren't going to work very well when you're running away from a tiger, so to speak. You know, the old thing that we talk about all the time. So it's really important to have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic balance. That's why the little balancing beams here, I hope you can see that pretty well. And so we see this is really, really important. And guess what I'm getting to? You probably have this already figured out. Food affects the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. There are foods, particular proteins, fats, and carbs. You know, now we're starting to look at, well, which proteins, which fats, and which carbs. Because another thing about food is that it does help regulate our sympathetic versus parasympathetic. And an interesting thing, just like with oxidative rate, that's burned in. That's kind of like you're a fast oxidizer. It's a genetic thing. You're an Eskimo, you're a fast oxidizer. You're from certain tribes in South America, they eat mostly carbohydrates, you're a slow oxidizer. Well, people come to us generally either sympathetic or parasympathetic dominant. And guess what? You can kind of tell almost sometimes by their personalities. The rest and digest types, laid back, kind of cool. And then you have your other type, your fight-flight, your fighty-flighty kind of people. We would call them maybe A personalities. Do you know any? Maybe you know you're one. Now, since we know food, the particular proteins, fats, and carbs, we know that food can stimulate the sympathetic or parasympathetic. Well, if you're sort of naturally an A-type, fight-flight, would you want to eat the foods that stimulate the sympathetic nervous system and get out of balance this way? No, you would not. If you're sort of everyday normally balanced this way, you're more of a sympathetic. What kind of foods do you want to eat? You'd want to eat the ones that stimulate the parasympathetic system and come back like that. So guess what? We happen to have some knowledge of foods that stimulate the parasympathetic and foods that stimulate the sympathetic. And that's how we want to keep this in balance. So this is kind of the next level of how to figure out what the perfect diet is for you. We covered macro, protein, fat, and carbs. That is the number one thing to do. You want to get that right first. And then you can start playing around with which proteins, which fats, and which carbohydrates. For some people, you're going to find that fruit just doesn't really work very well. You might want to eliminate that. For other people, fruit's going to be the perfect thing. So it's a little funny, but you got to do this. Another big difference would be the protein. Some people are very good on the white meats, like just the breast meat, chicken, and that stuff. Other people, who like steaks, and they might even, the real dense stuff would be like organ meats, like people who eat liver and kidneys and the hearts and those parts. They're real fast oxidizers. And so they might not do as well on the white meats and that kind of thing. Now there's more information coming, but that's another thing to think about, why food is so important and why we say that diet is the number one influence on your health. And in an otherwise healthy person, they don't have something else that's really dysfunctional in their body, their immune system or digestion or their detoxification systems and things like that. If diet's going to fix that person, they're going to do this, and then they're going to find out which foods do this, and then they're really going to be have a good chance at least at being well balanced and having what's truly a well balanced diet for that individual. So I hope that helps clarify things a little bit, and there's more coming. So thanks for being patient and hanging in there with us.